The signal came in at 347, Galactic Standard, on a frequency the Varn Junko's salvage arrays were never built to receive. Kael heard it first. Not because he was listening, he'd been running inventory on the hull plating stripped from a derelict Makosi freighter, his coffee cold, his shift 2 hours from over, but because the Junko's passive collector bank swept everything within 8 light minutes on automatic, and this particular emission punched through every filter the ship had. It registered on the radiation suite. It registered on comms. It registered, impossibly, on the mass detector, as though the signal carried weight. He set the plating manifest aside and leaned into the console. Junko, isolate band 773. Full spectrum. The ship's processing core, a rebuilt military unit Kael had pulled from a scrapped Terran frigate 6 years ago, complied without comment. The waveform filled his secondary display, a repeating burst, 11 seconds on, 4 seconds off, structured in a way that made the hair on his forearms stand. Not random, not natural, not anything in the Terran Distress Codex or any of the 17 known alien emergency protocols his license required him to carry. Something else entirely. He played it through the cabin speakers. The sound was low, harmonic, layered 3 tones braided around each other in a pattern that almost resolved into meaning and then slid away, like a word on the tip of a tongue in a language nobody spoke. His chest tightened. Not fear. Something older than fear, something that sat in the body before the brain caught up. A recognition that had no name yet. Kael had been a deep space salvage operator for 14 years. He'd hauled dead ships from asteroid fields, cut open frozen hulks that hadn't seen power in centuries, and once spent 11 days alone in a breached cargo hold waiting for a tow that came 6 hours after his reserve oxygen should have run out. He did not rattle easily. But the signal made him sit straighter, and he noticed his hand had moved to the console without instruction, as though some part of him wanted to answer before the rest had decided whether answering was wise. He pulled the hand back, pressed it flat against his thigh. Junko, triangulate source. Give me range and bearing. The answer came in 3 seconds. The source was 4.7 light-minutes away, bearing 42 by -18, deep inside the Kessler Shoals, a stretch of interstellar debris so dense with wrecked hulls and shattered planetoids that no commercial lane came within 50 AU. Kael worked the shoals because nobody else would. The insurance was murderous, the profit margins thin, and the solitude absolute. In 14 years he had never encountered another living vessel inside the field. He had encountered plenty of dead ones. That was the job. The signal pulsed again, that braided harmonic climbing through his speakers, and he felt it in his sternum, a vibration that didn't belong to sound alone. Somewhere in the back of his mind, a cold professional voice told him to log the coordinates with Terran Salvage Authority and continue his shift. The shoals were not a place for curiosity. He was one man in a 60-meter salvage tug with a hull patched in 9 places and a reactor that needed a full overhaul he couldn't afford. Standard procedure was clear. Unknown signal of possible non-human origin. File coordinates. Notify authorities. Do not approach. But the signal was not a distress call. It was not a beacon. It was not a warning. It was not the electromagnetic residue of a dead system cycling through its last reserves. It was an invitation. And Kael, against every protocol that governed his license, against 14 years of survival discipline that had kept him alive in a place that killed the careless, turned his ship toward it. He ran a full systems check first. Old habit, the kind that becomes reflex when your life depends on a ship that was never designed to be reliable. The Junko was not a warship and not a science vessel. She was a 60-meter salvage tug, built 31 years ago at the Themis yard on Ceres and decommissioned after her second owner stripped her sensor suite for parts. Kael had bought the hull at auction for a price that reflected its condition, which was terrible. He'd spent 2 years rebuilding her in a rented bay at Corinth Station. New reactor core salvaged from a Terran frigate wreck, refurbished life support from a decommissioned medical transport. Navigation systems cobbled together from 3 separate models that had never been designed to talk to each other, but which Kale had convinced to cooperate through a combination of custom wiring, hand-soldered bypass circuits, and vocabulary that would have made a dockworker blush. The hull was patched in 9 places with different grades of alloy, each patch a different color where the factory coating had been ground away. The starboard maneuvering thruster had a response delay of 0.3 seconds that he'd learned to compensate for without thinking. The port cargo bay door didn't seal properly and had to be dogged manually with a wrench he kept velcroed to the bulkhead. The coffee maker worked perfectly. He had his priorities. Systems check came back clean. Everything within tolerance, which for the Junko meant nothing was actively on fire. He plotted a course through the debris field toward the signal source and engaged the drive at minimum power, threading between the slowly rotating hulks that populated the shoals like gravestones in a cemetery that spanned light years. The debris thickened as he pushed deeper. He'd worked the outer ring for years, where the wrecks were Makosi and Vithiri species whose metallurgy he knew by sight, whose salvage value he could calculate in his head while cutting through a hull with a plasma torch. Makosi ships were iron-nickel composite, heavy and durable, their structural beams worth good money at the recycling stations past the Jovian yards. Vithiri ships were lighter, built from a ceramic-metal hybrid that was harder to cut but more valuable per kilogram. Both had been spacefaring civilizations that went to war with each other in this region approximately 800,000 years ago. Both had lost. The shoals were their mutual graveyard, and Kale had been picking through it for the better part of a decade. These deeper wrecks were different. Their hulls were darker, not painted or coated, but inherently dark, as though the material itself absorbed light. The surface textures were wrong in a way that made his salvage operator's eye itch. Organic-looking, curved where military design demanded angles, covered in formations that resembled coral or bone rather than welded plate. No seams, no rivets, no evidence of separate components assembled. Each ship looked like a single continuous piece, grown rather than manufactured, as though someone had planted a seed and waited for a warship to sprout. Some of them still held faint thermal signatures, internal processes running on minimal power for epochs, slowly winding toward a silence they hadn't quite reached. He logged each one but did not stop. These were not the find. They were the trail. The signal's harmonic shifted as he moved deeper, a 4th tone appearing beneath the original 3, then a 5th. Each new layer pulled at a different part of his awareness. One seemed to resonate with his visual cortex, faint color shifts at the edges of his vision, blues and golds that weren't coming from his instruments. Another vibrated in his inner ear, giving him a sense of spatial orientation that extended far beyond the Junko's hull, as though he could feel the shape of the debris field around him the way a swimmer feels current. He checked his oxygen mixture twice. Clean. The signal was not a contaminant. It was a preparation. He was being tuned. At 2.1 light minutes from the source, the mass detector spiked. He'd seen large objects in the shoals. The field was littered with the corpses of ships from wars fought before humanity left its home system. The largest he'd mapped was a Vithiri dreadnought, 1.8 kilometers bow to stern, its spine snapped by whatever killed it, the two halves drifting apart at a rate of centimeters per century. The mass reading on his display was not 1.8 kilometers. It was not even in the same category. Junko, confirm mass reading. Source bearing 42-18. Confirmed. Object mass estimated at 1.7 times 10 to the 11th kilograms. Effective length indeterminate. Debris occlusion prevents full return. Minimum estimated dimension, 14 kilometers. His mouth went dry. A literal desiccation, his body pulling moisture inward as though preparing for something it understood at a cellular level. He rechecked calibration, ran the sweep again, switched to backup instruments, a mass scanner he'd salvaged from a decommissioned survey ship and installed as redundancy, because redundancy was what kept you alive in the shoals. The backup agreed with the primary. 14 kilometers, minimum, possibly more, hidden behind the debris. Nothing of that size existed in his records. Nothing of that size existed in anyone's records. The largest known vessel ever built by any species was the Terran Sovereignty's orbital shipyard at Callisto, 9 kilometers across a massive industrial platform, 40,000 permanent personnel anchored to a gravity well. A station, fixed, immobile, not a vessel. 14 kilometers of mobile structure was not just large, it was a category error. It was the kind of measurement that made you check your instruments 3 times, and then check the instruments that checked your instruments, because the alternative, that the number was correct, required you to abandon everything you thought you knew about what was possible. But the signal was coming from it. He cut active emissions and drifted on momentum alone, using the debris field as cover out of instinct. The wrecks around him changed further. The organic curves became more pronounced. Some hulls had fused together over millions of years, their boundaries blurring into composite structures that looked less like a debris field and more like a reef, something that had been settling into itself over geological time, growing slowly, accumulating mass. He passed through a gap between 2 fused wrecks, barely 40 meters. Proximity alarms chirping as the hull came within 6 meters of the organic surface, and the source came into view. The first thing he registered was the space, not the object, the space around it. A sphere of emptiness nearly 20 kilometers across, carved into the densest part of the debris field with a precision that was immediately, viscerally wrong. The wrecks ended at a clean boundary, not scattered, not thinning. They stopped as though the field had been cut with a blade, and beyond the boundary was nothing. Clean vacuum, silent. The object occupied the center of this clearing, and the clearing existed because the object permitted it to exist. The object itself was elongated, vaguely elliptical, its surface a deep iridescent black that shifted through blue and violet as the Junko's running lights swept across it in a slow pass. At 14 kilometers, it was too large to see all at once from this distance. His forward viewports showed perhaps a third of its length, a curve of dark hull that filled his field of vision from edge to edge and kept going. No visible engines, no weapons ports, no viewports, no seams. No hatches, docking clamps, sensor arrays, communication dishes, or any of the 10,000 external features that every ship Kale had ever seen possessed. The surface was continuous, unbroken, seamless, alive with a faint bioluminescent pulse that tracked the rhythm of the signal, exactly 11 seconds bright, 4 seconds dark. It was the most beautiful thing Kale Rwan had ever seen. He had not known until that moment that an artifact could be beautiful. He had known landscapes could be beautiful, and faces, and the particular quality of light at a certain time of day on a certain coastline back on Earth. But he had never looked at a constructed thing, a piece of engineering, an object built by hands or their equivalent, and felt beauty hit him like a physical blow. This did. And it terrified him. Not the way a weapon terrifies, the way depth terrifies. Standing at the edge of a trench that drops beyond seeing, feeling the mass of water below, and understanding for the first time that the world has dimensions you never bothered to consider. Junko, full passive scan. Everything you've got, do not transmit. 90 seconds. Every reading that came back made the next one harder to believe. The hull was composed of materials returning no match against the known periodic table, not unknown alloys or exotic composites, but substances whose atomic structure did not correspond to any known element or combination of elements. He ran the analysis twice, recalibrated, and ran it a third time. Same result. The hull was made of matter that, by the standards of human physics, should not exist. Internal temperature, 2.7 degrees above absolute zero, colder than the surrounding vacuum. That was thermodynamically impossible, An object in space reaches equilibrium with the cosmic microwave background. To be colder meant the object was actively absorbing thermal energy from its environment, pulling heat inward through a mechanism Kale's instruments could not identify. No electromagnetic emissions beyond the signal. No radiation. No heat plume from any drive system. For 14 kilometers of mass, it was the quietest object he had ever encountered. Quieter than rock. Quieter than vacuum itself. And it was old. The spectral analysis of dust accumulation on the surface returned an estimate he read 3 times before accepting. Not thousands of years, not millions. The object had been sitting in this clearing, broadcasting its harmonic into empty space for approximately 230 million years. Before humanity existed, before the mammals that would become humanity existed. When this object was built, Earth was in the middle of the Permian period. The dominant land animals were synapsids, proto-mammals the size of dogs. The oldest known spacefaring civilization, the Vithiri, would not achieve interstellar flight for another 229 million years. The builders of this object had been waiting since, before humanity's ancestors had figured out how to be warm-blooded. Kale sat in his pilot's chair and breathed. The cabin was quiet except for the hum of life support and the faint pulse of the signal playing through his speakers. He looked at his hands. They were shaking. Not with fear, he knew fear had worked beside it for 14 years, and this was not it. They were shaking the way hands shake when the body recognizes it has arrived at a threshold the mind is not ready to cross. The signal's directional analysis confirmed what he already felt. The broadcast had shifted. When he'd first detected it at 4.7 light minutes, it had been omnidirectional, a general call aimed at everything. Now, at 300 meters, it was focused. A beam aimed at the Junko, at him. In the pause between pulses, he felt something that was not the signal. A low, patient awareness, not hostile, not benign. Simply present the way a mountain is present, the way gravity is present, the way the deep ocean is present when you float above water that has no bottom you can see. It knew he was there, and it had turned to look. "Okay," he said aloud. His voice was steady, his hands were not. "Okay." He could leave, fire the Junko's drive and be back in charted space in 2 days, file his report. Let the Admiralty send a proper contact team with proper equipment and proper authority. That was what his license required. That was the correct decision. But the signal was not aimed at the Admiralty. It was aimed at him. And somewhere beneath the professional calculus of risk and protocol, in the place where decisions are made before reasons are found, Kale Rwan knew that if he left now, something would be lost. Not the opportunity, the object would still be here. Something smaller, something personal. The chance to be the one who answered, rather than the one who reported. He transmitted a standard Terran identification burst. Name, registry, species, point of origin. The simplest package in the codex, the one you sent when you didn't know who was listening. The signal stopped. For the first time in a continuous broadcast that his drift accumulation models estimated at a minimum of 9 years, and the true duration was certainly far longer, centuries at least, possibly millennia, the harmonic went silent. The bioluminescence died. The clearing went dark except for the faint reflected starlight off the surrounding wrecks. Kale's heart rate reached 114. He gripped the armrests. The silence was absolute and charged, not empty but full, the silence of something thinking. 31 seconds. Then the object answered. Not on radio, not on any electromagnetic frequency. The Junko's comms array registered nothing. The answer came through the hull, a vibration that traveled through the ship's structure and into Kale's bones, a resonance that carried information the way music carries emotion, below language, below symbol, in the architecture of the waveform itself. He understood it the way he understood cold or hunger, or the particular quality of light that meant a storm was coming. It was asking him what he was. Not his species, not his government or his technology or his threat level. What he was. The question had a depth that made his eyes water, as though something vast and patient had spent 200 million years formulating the most precise question it could ask, and had finally found someone to ask it to. He pressed his palm flat against the Junko's console, the surface he had touched 10,000 times, the ship he had rebuilt with his own hands from a hull that 3 yards had condemned, and let the vibration carry whatever it found. He did not compose a message. He did not select data. He simply sat there, one man in a battered salvage tug, and let himself be read. 4 minutes and 11 seconds by the Junko's clock. The most exposed he had ever felt, not violated, not invaded, but seen, the way you are seen by someone whose only agenda is to understand what they are looking at. The vibration moved through him like a current, and wherever it passed it found things. Calluses built over years of work. The scar on his left forearm where a plasma cutter had slipped. The sound of his mother's voice, which he hadn't heard in 17 years. The smell of rain on the coast where he'd grown up, and the fact that he still dreamed about it. Every repair he had made. Every wreck he had given up on. The 11 days in the breached cargo hold, and the particular quality of silence that comes when you've made peace with dying, and then have to unmake it because the tow arrived. Every morning he had woken up alone in the dark of deep space, and decided, for no reason he could articulate, to keep going. Not judged, witnessed, with the patience of something that had spent eons learning that witnessing was enough. When it was done, the bioluminescence returned but changed. The 11-4 pattern was gone. The object's surface glowed with steady amber gold light, the color of a sunset Kale had not seen since leaving Earth 22 years ago. Not approximated. The exact color, the exact warmth, as though the object had found that memory inside him and held it up to show him it understood what it meant. The vibration shifted from question to recognition, not surprise, not excitement. The quiet, vast satisfaction of a hypothesis confirmed across epochs that somewhere in the machinery of the universe, something like him existed, something that could be afraid and keep moving, something that fixed broken things because broken things deserved to be fixed. It knew what he was now, and it was glad. Kale sat in the amber light. His face was wet. He wiped his eyes with the heel of his palm and was not ashamed. Then the object moved. The mass detector screamed a sound he'd heard only twice before, both times near wrecks with live ordnance. 14 kilometers of ancient hull shifted orientation by 6 degrees, not with engines, not with thrust, not with any detectable force. It moved the way a thought moves without mechanics, as though the object had simply decided to be in a different position and the universe had complied. The debris field trembled. Wrecks that had been stable for millennia drifted aside, as though pushed by an invisible hand. Kale fired maneuvering thrusters hard to hold station against the displacement wave, the starboard delay nearly costing him. 6 seconds of fighting inertia the object apparently did not experience. When his hand stopped shaking enough to release the controls, he looked up. A section of the object's hull, a circle nearly 300 meters across, 5 times the Junko's length, had become transparent. Not a viewport. The hull itself had changed state, shifting from opaque to something as clear as air. Inside, the object was full. Lattices of crystal and light filled the interior, interconnected in patterns that hurt to follow with the eye, that seemed to fold through more dimensions than the 3 his brain was built to process. Colors he had no names for moved through the lattices like liquid, and among them, moving with unhurried grace, were shapes, not machines, not organisms, something between, each one glowing with the hull's bioluminescence, each one different, each one turning toward the transparent section and regarding the Junko with the attention of a species that had been waiting longer than the human mind could comfortably hold. Hundreds, perhaps thousands. Junko, are you recording? Affirmative, all passive sensors active. He sat for 6 hours. They showed him things delivered through hull vibration as memory, each one arriving with the specificity and weight of lived experience rather than data. A star forming, not a diagram but the heat on his face, the pressure in his chest, the blinding light and the silence that existed before there was anything close enough to hear. A planet cooling, the slow crust hardening, the rain beginning, falling for thousands of years into oceans that covered everything. Life in warm tidal pools, something stirring, reaching toward the surface the way a hand reaches toward a doorknob with intention. A civilization rising over millions of years, building cities that looked like music scored in crystal, ships that looked like seeds, stations that orbited their sun in patterns that were also language. And then the decision. It came to him as a feeling more than a narrative. The civilization had reached the point where it could have expanded, could have crossed the void, found whatever else existed, imposed itself or introduced itself or conquered or converted. They had the technology. They had the numbers. They had a fleet of vessels that could cross galaxies the way Kale's tug crossed the shoals. They chose not to. Not from weakness, not from fear, not from indifference, from a principle so deeply held it registered in Kale's chest like a second heartbeat, that the act of reaching out must be answerable, that you do not knock on a door unless you are willing to stand there when it opens, that the first word between strangers must be offered, not imposed. So they built the object, vessel and message and act of faith. They seeded the shoals with it because the shoals were a crossroads where the wrecks of dead civilizations accumulated, where scavengers and explorers and the merely curious might come. They calculated that any species persistent enough to work the debris field, patient enough to listen, brave enough to follow an unknown signal into the dark, would be worth meeting. They had not expected 230 million years, but they had not been surprised. He asked why patience over pursuit, not in words in the shape of the question as it formed in his mind, the vibration carrying it the way it carried everything else. The answer came as an image, a hand open palm up, not reaching, not grasping, offering. And beside it, the patience of a gardener who plants a seed knowing the tree will outlive him, knowing the shade will fall on someone he will never meet, and finding that sufficient. They did not conquer, they did not explore, they invited, and they waited. He left at 1622 Galactic Standard. The vibration made clear that goodbye did not translate. Departure was temporary, an intermission in a conversation that had only just begun. They could wait for him to return. They had been waiting for 230 million years. A few more weeks was not a thing they would notice. The signal resumed as the Junko's drive engaged the 11-4 harmonic, but with a new thread woven in. His own voice, speaking his name. They had added him to the invitation. Kale listened to it until the signal faded below the noise floor, somewhere around the outer edge of the shoals, and then he listened to the silence where it had been, and the silence was different now. It had a shape, a warmth, an expectation. He pointed the Junko toward Relay Station Bravo 7 and tried to figure out how to explain to someone in a uniform what had just happened to him. The transit to Relay Station Bravo 7 took 9 days. Kale spent the first 3 reviewing every second of his recordings, frame by frame, sweep by sweep, trying to find the moment where the data stopped making sense. He never found it. The data had stopped making sense at the first signal burst and had not resumed. He wrote his report in plain language, no embellishment, no interpretation, just what happened, measured where measurable, estimated where not. He attached every data file the Junko had collected, passive scans, spectral analyses, mass readings, the signal recordings in every format his equipment could produce. He appended his own biometric readings, including cortisol levels that dropped below baseline during the communication phase, a physiological impossibility he flagged without attempting to explain. The report ran to 47 pages. He rewrote it twice. The first draft sounded like a man trying to convince someone of something extraordinary. The second sounded like a report. That was what he needed it to be. He spent the next 3 days failing to sleep. The signal played in his memory on a loop, beneath his thoughts like an underground river, not intrusive, not painful, but constant, a low harmonic presence that colored everything the way a mood colors a room. He heard echoes of it in the Junko's ventilation system, in the cycling of the reactor, in the particular frequency of the coffee maker's heating element. Once at 300, he caught himself humming the 3-part melody in the shower, the acoustics of the tiny cubicle turning his voice into something that almost matched the original, and he stopped so hard his jaw ached from clenching. He wasn't frightened by it. That was what kept him awake. He should have been frightened. Something had moved through his mind with the intimacy of a lover and the scope of a god, and the predominant emotion he carried away from the experience was gratitude. That bothered him more than fear would have. The last 3 days he thought about what to say at Bravo 7. He was a salvage operator, Class 3 license, independent contractor, no corporate backing, no institutional affiliation, no rank, no credentials, no authority beyond the legal right to strip dead ships for parts in a designated debris field. He was the first human to make contact with an intelligence older than terrestrial life, and he'd done it in a ship held together with field welds and optimism, wearing coveralls that needed washing. Bravo 7 was a Terran Sovereignty relay station, a squat, functional platform orbiting a dead rock at the edge of the shoal's commercial exclusion zone. 40 personnel. Supply runs every 3 weeks. The kind of posting you got when someone wanted you out of the way, or when you'd specifically requested quiet. Lieutenant Vasquez ran the station with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in the deep long enough to know that the interesting signals were always the ones you didn't expect. She met him in the station's briefing room. Small table, 2 chairs, a display wall showing the station's exterior cameras and a feed of local traffic, which at the moment consisted of exactly 1 ship. The Junko, docked at the station's port gantry, her patched hull looking even more disreputable than usual against the station's clean military lines. Mr. Juan. Vasquez was sharp-eyed and direct, the kind of officer who read people the way Kale read hull metallurgy, quickly and with confidence in her assessment. You transmitted on the first contact encryption channel. You understand that channel exists for a specific purpose, and its misuse carries penalties. I do. You're claiming a first contact event in the Kessler Shoals, where nothing alive has been found in 38 years of licensed salvage operations. That's correct. She studied him. He'd lost weight, the Junko's food stores were adequate but uninspiring, and he'd been too preoccupied to eat properly. He hadn't slept well. He was wearing the same coveralls he'd worn the night of the signal, washed once in the Junko's inadequate laundry unit. But his eyes were clear and his hands, when he placed them on the table, were still. How large is the contact? 14 kilometers. Her hand moved to the priority channel before he finished the second word. Not because she believed him, not yet, but because a salvage operator with 14 years in the shoals does not use first contact encryption for a sensor ghost, and the number he'd given was large enough that the consequences of not escalating immediately outweighed the consequences of being wrong. Within 72 hours, Admiralty Command assembled a task force at Corinth Station, 3 systems away. The speed of the response told Kale something about how seriously they were taking this. Normal procedure for a possible first contact report from an unaffiliated civilian would have been a verification team, 3 or 4 officers in a fast Corvette, sent to confirm or dismiss. Instead, the Admiralty mobilized a full contact group. Carrier TSN Meridian, 900 meters, crew complement of 3,000, flight operations capable of deploying 200 fighters and 40 utility craft. 46 escorts ranging from destroyer to frigate class, arranged in 3 defensive layers. 2 dedicated science ships, the Ptolemy and the Curie, each carrying labs that could analyze everything from atmospheric composition to quantum state materials. A diplomatic contingent of 14 officials representing 3 Terran governmental bodies. A xenolinguistics team of 9 specialists who had spent their careers preparing for exactly this scenario and had never expected to actually deploy. A first contact medical unit trained in the biological assessment of unknown entities and the biological protection of human crews exposed to unknown stimuli. And the heavy dreadnought TSN Argo. Cale had seen the Argo twice before, once in a newscast, once from a distance of 60 kilometers when she transited the Corinth shipping lane on her way to somewhere classified. She was 2.4 kilometers long, massed more than any other vessel in the Terran fleet, and her presence in any system was a statement that required no translation. She was not a diplomatic tool. She was a final argument. The Admiralty had sent her because they did not know what waited in the shoals, and because when you do not know, you bring the thing that doesn't need to know. 27 days after the first signal, Cale Juan stood on the Meridian's bridge and tried to remember what his life had been like before the harmonic. He was aboard at the direct request of Rear Admiral Chen Weilin, who commanded the task force. Quarters 3 decks below the bridge, a cabin 4 times the size of his bunk on the Junko, with a bed that didn't vibrate when the reactor cycled. Security detail he hadn't asked for, and didn't need 2 Marines who followed him at a discreet distance. Less for his protection than because the Admiralty wasn't entirely certain what the signal might have done to him, and wanted eyes on their only asset who had been in direct contact with the entity. The bridge was everything the Junko wasn't wide, staffed by 30 officers at individual stations, lit by tactical displays that showed the task force's formation in 3 dimensions. The forward viewport alone was larger than Cale's entire ship. For 14 years, his world had been the Junko's cabin, a space you could cross in 6 strides, where every tool hung within arm's reach, where the entire interface between one human and the universe consisted of 3 screens and a coffee maker. Now he stood in a carrier group's nerve center, salvage coveralls among pressed uniforms, the only civilian aboard, the only person in the formation who knew what waited at bearing 42-18. Admiral Chen had briefed him privately before departure. Compact, late 50s, gray at the temples, with the specific calm that comes from 30 years of making decisions that affect millions of lives and living with the results. She didn't ask him whether he was sure. She asked him what he'd felt. You understand that what you've described changes every strategic calculus the Sovereignty maintains. He nodded. An entity of that age, its technology isn't advanced, Mr. Juan. It's categorically different. The material science alone would take our best researchers decades to begin to comprehend, assuming the underlying physics are even accessible to human cognition. I know. And it communicated through a medium we cannot replicate, intercept, or analyze. A vibration that carries structured information through solid matter without electromagnetic transmission. Our physicists don't have a name for it. They don't have a theory for it. They don't even have a category to put it in. That's correct. Intelligence calls it a possible lure, a construct designed to attract exactly the kind of response we're mounting. It's not a trap. How do you know? He thought about how to answer that. The honest answer was that he knew it in his body, in the marrow-deep certainty that comes from having been truly seen by something that had no reason to deceive. But that was not an answer a rear admiral could put in a briefing document. Because it waited 230 million years, nothing that wants to trap you waits that long. There are more efficient methods. It sent music, not a threat. It asked what I was, not what I carried, not what my government was, not what weapons I had, what I was. Silence. Perhaps, or perhaps patience is the most effective strategy of all. Then we find out together, Admiral, That's why you brought the Argo. Ghost of a smile, the first he'd seen on her face. That is exactly why I brought the Argo, Mr. Wan. The task force entered the Kessler Shoals in formation. Meridian at center, escorts arranged in 3 concentric layers, inner ring destroyers, middle ring frigates, outer ring fast corvettes running sensor sweeps. The science ships Ptolemy and Curie tucked behind the inner ring. The Argo at the formation's trailing edge. Her massive hull a constant presence at the bottom of every tactical display. Every officer aboard every ship aware of her the way you are aware of a loaded weapon in the room. The debris field closed around them. Ancient wrecks tumbling in the slow gravity of mutual attraction, their hulls dark against the stars. The navigational AI plotted courses through gaps that barely accommodated the Meridian's beam, and Kale watched from the bridge as officers who had spent their careers in open space learned what it meant to fly through a graveyard. Sensors painted the wrecks in false color by composition. Makhosi blue, Vithiri green, unknown signatures in red. The outer ring was mostly blue and green familiar metallurgies, the detritus of the 800,000-year-old war that had created the shoals. As the formation pushed deeper, the red increased. First isolated contacts, then clusters, then entire sections of the field where every wreck glowed red on the display. Organic curves, impossible materials, the same grown-not-built architecture Kale had cataloged on his approach. Commander Torres, the Meridian's senior signals officer, tracked the contacts from his station on the port side of the bridge. 22 years in signals intelligence. 3 alien contact exercises, all simulations. He'd been selected for this deployment because he was the best the Sovereignty had, and Kale could see the tension in his shoulders as the red signatures multiplied. "Captain," Torres said to the Meridian's commanding officer, "I'm counting over 600 unknown composition contacts in the inner debris ring. None of them match anything in our database. Some of them are still warm." "Warm how?" "Thermal residuals. Internal processes at minimal power. Most are below our detection threshold at normal sensitivity. I'm only seeing them because we're running full passive." "How long have they been running?" Torres checked his readings. "I can't give you a definitive answer, sir. The accumulation patterns suggest a very long time." The bridge absorbed that. A very long time, in the context of objects already known to predate human civilization, was not a comforting phrase. At 8:47, Torres sat upright. "Signal acquired. Bearing 42-18. 11-second burst, 4-second interval. Signal profile matches Mr. Wan's recordings exactly." Chen stepped to the forward railing. "Play it." Torres routed the signal to the bridge speakers. The harmonic climbed into the air between 30 officers, and the bridge went quiet in a way Kale recognized. It was not the quiet of discipline or training. It was the quiet of something reaching into the room and touching each person in a place they didn't know they had. Torres went pale. The navigator's hand stopped moving over her console. The helmsman turned his head. The weapons officer gripped his armrest. 22 years in signals intelligence, and Torres had never heard anything like it. Neither had anyone else, but they all recognized it. The same way Kale had, 27 days ago, alone in his cabin with his cold coffee and his worn-out coveralls. The body knew before the mind caught up. "What is that?" Torres asked. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The invitation," Kale said. They found the clearing at 9:14. The formation decelerated as the debris field ended at that clean, precise boundary. Wrecks on one side, nothing on the other, 20 kilometers of empty space separating the field from its center. The object was where Kale had left it, occupying the middle of the clearing, its hull dark, its bioluminescence dormant. On passive sensors it looked like a rock, a 14-kilometer rock, but a rock. Except for the signal. Chen studied the tactical display. Her task force 48 vessels, 12,000 crew, the most capable formation the Sovereignty could assemble on short notice, arranged in a careful hemisphere around the edge of the clearing. And at the center, patient, dark, impossibly old, the thing that had been broadcasting its invitation since before there were ears in the galaxy to hear it. Science team, full passive sweep, no active emissions under any circumstances. She turned to Kale. It responded to your transmission burst last time. It did. We are considerably more detectable than a 60-meter salvage tug. You are. Her gaze moved to the Argo's icon on the tactical display, the largest vessel in the formation, positioned at the edge of the clearing, her weapons cold but her presence undeniable. If it senses mass, it already knows about the Argo. It will know everything, Admiral, everything we are, everything we brought, and everything we intend. A pause, then, Tor's open channel. Standard identification burst with full diplomatic header. Terran Sovereignty, TSN Meridian, peaceful intent. First contact protocols active. The burst went out. A pulse of electromagnetic energy carrying the most comprehensive introduction humanity had ever composed, transmitted into the silence of a clearing that had been silent for 230 million years. The signal stopped. Every officer on the bridge went still, not a trained response, a physiological one. The silence after the signal's cessation was not the absence of sound, it was the presence of attention. 30 people on the Meridian's bridge feeling simultaneously, unmistakably, that something vast had turned toward them and was considering what it saw. Tor's hands were frozen above his console. The navigator stared at her display without reading it. The weapons officer's knuckles were white. Reports came in from every ship in the formation. The signal had ceased simultaneously across all frequencies, all receivers at every position. Whatever had been broadcasting had stopped, completely, all at once, as though a switch had been thrown. Kale counted, 11 seconds, 15, 17, longer than it had taken with him, processing more, 48 ships, 12,000 minds, the most complex input it had received in its entire existence. 19 seconds. The bioluminescence returned. Not amber, not the sunset gold it had shown Kale. White, pure, intense, blazing across 14 kilometers of hull with an intensity that turned the clearing into noon. The viewports auto-dimmed. Officers shielded their eyes. The tactical display bleached to static for 2 seconds before the sensors recalibrated. And the vibration came. Bigger than anything Kale had felt on the Junco. Through the Meridian superstructure like a chord played on a continental instrument, resonating in every beam and bulkhead and deck plate, carrying with it not just awareness but full, total, undivided attention. It was looking at all of them, every ship, every person. Each one individually, the way Kale had been seen in his cabin but scaled. A single intelligence conducting 12,000 simultaneous conversations through the medium of a warship's hull. Chen gripped the bridge railing. Officers braced against their stations. Stress indicators on the crew status board flickered elevated heart rates, cortisol spikes, but all green. Every escort reporting hull vibration with no detectable source. The science ships recording anomalous readings across 11 separate instrument categories. The Argo, most distant from the object, reporting the strongest vibration of any vessel in the formation. It knows about the Argo, Kale said quietly. It's scaling the signal to match each ship's mass. The bigger the receiver, the more it's saying. Is it threatened? He listened, not with his ears, with the thing the vibration spoke to the architecture beneath language, the place where understanding lives before words find it. The presence was vast, ancient beyond comprehension, and it was not hostile, not afraid, not defensive, interested, the precise quality of a scholar discovering an unexpected reading in a decade-studied text. The quality of a teacher meeting a student who asks the right question. No, it's curious why we brought it. Curious what it means that we came with enough force to fight a war but transmitted peaceful intent. Chen absorbed that, a reasonable question. They think in long timelines, Admiral. To them, the fact that we brought a dreadnought isn't a threat. It's information. It tells them something about what we are. Science team report. Dr. Marin Akaffer on the secondary bridge. Her voice controlled with the particular discipline of a scientist watching her entire framework of understanding collapse in real time. Admiral, hull composition is unknown. I don't mean exotic or advanced. I mean unknown. The atomic structures we're reading don't correspond to any element in the standard model. Our analytical software wasn't designed for this data because this data shouldn't exist. I've run the analysis 4 times. The results are consistent and impossible. Pause. Internal temperature reads 2.7 degrees above absolute zero, colder than the surrounding vacuum by a margin that should require energy input exceeding the output of a main sequence star. There is no detectable power source. The object is thermodynamically impossible. Continue. Age estimate based on dust accumulation, cosmic ray exposure, and isotopic decay analysis. 230 million years, plus or minus 12 million. For context, the oldest known alien artifact prior to this contact is the Vithiri archive, estimated at 800,000 years. This object is older by a factor of approximately 300. Silence on the bridge. The vibration, Doctor. That's the most concerning reading, Admiral. The vibration is not acoustic, not electromagnetic, not gravitational. It does not propagate through vacuum in any way our instruments can detect, yet it propagates through solid matter hull plating, structural beams, deck plates, without loss of coherence or intensity. Every hull in this formation is a receiver for a medium we have no theory for. The Argo reports the strongest vibration despite being at the greatest distance from the object. The entity is scaling its signal to each receiver's mass, individually. The word scaling landed on the bridge like a physical weight, not broadcasting uniformly, not sending the same message in all directions, targeting, choosing what to say to each ship based on what that ship was. Information density is significant. Each vibration pulse carries more data than our entire communication suite transmits in a standard day. We cannot decode it. I'm not certain we have the cognitive architecture to decode it. What Mr. Wan experienced, the images, the emotions, the shared memories, may be the only interface available to us. The entity communicates in a medium our instruments can detect, but our minds appear to be the only receivers capable of interpreting. The bridge was quiet. White light from the viewports, vibration in every arch and joint of the meridian's frame. The transparent section appeared. 300 meters of hull shifting from opaque iridescent black to something as clear as deep water. Inside, the lattices crystal and light folding through geometries that the eye wanted to follow but couldn't, patterns that existed in dimensions the brain acknowledged without being able to count. Colors moved through the structures like weather through atmosphere, not individual hues but systems of color, complex and shifting and self-referential, each shade responding to the shades around it the way a conversation responds to itself. And among the lattices, thousands of beings, glowing with the hull's bioluminescence in blues and golds and colors that had no terrestrial names, each one different size, different shape, different configuration of the light that comprised them, arranged in patterns that might have been ceremony or mathematics or both, or neither, or something for which humanity had no category because it had never needed one before. They were facing the fleet. Not first contact. That had happened 18 days ago in a battered salvage tug, when a man who repaired broken things let himself be seen by something that had waited 230 million years to look. This was the introduction, the formal version, the moment when you've met someone privately and now you bring your family. The vibration shifted. Not just on the meridian. Across every hull, every ship, every vessel in the formation. Images arriving through solid matter the way weather arrives through air you didn't choose to receive it. It was simply there, around you, inside you, part of the environment. Torres dropped his stylus. The navigator pressed both palms flat against her console without understanding why. On the Argo, a weapons officer later reported tears he could not explain, not sadness, not joy, but the physiological response to being held in an attention so complete it felt like being cradled. The images were simple: a hand open, palm up, a door wide, light spilling through, a table set for two. Then the table grew, more places appeared, chairs. The room expanded, not metaphor, not symbol, but a demonstration of what the interior was doing in real time. Opening chambers that had been sealed longer than humanity had existed. Unfolding corridors built specifically for this purpose 230 million years ago by builders who believed, with a patience that defied every survival instinct the universe had ever taught any species, that someone would come. They were making room. Beneath the images, carried in the vibration's deeper harmonics, a message that was not words but was as clear as words have ever been. We have been alone so long, we are glad you came. We have made a place for you. Sit down, tell us what you are, we have so much to tell you. Admiral Chen stood on her bridge, hands on the railing, eyes burning. Around her, 30 officers in various states of professional composure, each one hearing the same thing, each one hearing it differently, each one certain of the same core, that something ancient and intelligent and profoundly lonely had just opened its door and asked them in. Mr. Yuan, her voice was not entirely steady, they set a place for us. They set it a long time ago, Admiral, before the dinosaurs, before the trees. They said it and they waited, and they never stopped believing someone would sit down. She straightened. A visible effort of will, the professional discipline of 30 years asserting itself over whatever the vibration had opened in her chest. She looked at the object, vast, ancient, blazing white. Its builders looking through their 300-meter window at a fleet representing the furthest reach of an infant species, and she made a decision. Tours, open return channel, full diplomatic packet, then whatever Mr. Yuan did. Admiral, put your palm on the console, let them read us, all of us. Tours looked at Kale. Kale nodded. Tours looked at the console, his hand was shaking. He placed it flat. Akafer's voice from the secondary bridge. Admiral, I have to register a formal objection. We have no model for this interface. Reading the neural patterns of 12,000 crew through hull contact is a biological risk I cannot assess with any confidence. It could alter cognitive function in ways that wouldn't be detectable for weeks. We could be consenting to something we don't have the vocabulary to describe. Chen didn't turn from the viewport. Mr. Yuan, lasting effects. I hear it sometimes, like a remembered song. Not the signal itself, the warmth of it, like an afterimage of light. It doesn't hurt, it doesn't interfere, it's just there. Would you do it again? I'm here, aren't I? She turned to the secondary bridge display where Akafer's face was rigid with professional concern. Doctor, they read one man through a 60-meter tug and the result was a sunset. The color of a sunset he hadn't seen in 22 years, reproduced perfectly, offered as proof of understanding. I'll risk a carrier. Log your objection. It is noted and overruled. Tor's hand was already flat. The vibration shifted denser, warmer, a new voice joining a choir that had been singing alone for geological ages. His eyes widened. His breath caught. Then he exhaled slowly, and something in his face changed, the tension going out of it, not replaced by blankness, but by a focus so complete it looked like peace. Then the navigator placed her hand. The vibration shifted again. Another voice. then weapons, then the helmsman, then communications, life support, tactical. One by one, without orders, the bridge crew made contact. Word spread not through intercom, but through the vibration itself, intent carrying through the hull the way command carries through discipline. But softer, without hierarchy, an invitation repeated ship by ship, as each crew felt what the previous crew had felt and understood what was being asked. Engineering, hands on reactor housings, palms against the warm metal that contained the reactions that kept them alive. Medics, pressed to bulkheads, feeling the vibration move through their bodies with the diagnostic intimacy of their own instruments. Hangar pilots, touching the cold skin of their fighters, feeling a response that turned dead metal into a conduit. Marine detachments, calloused hands flat against the walls of their barracks, hardened soldiers letting themselves be seen by something that had no interest in their training or their weapons, only in what they were beneath the armor. Understanding rippled outward. Escorts first, the destroyers closest to the meridian, their smaller hulls vibrating with a frequency their crews described as singing. Then the frigates, the corvettes, the science ships, where researchers pressed their hands against lab benches and felt data arrive through a medium that made their instruments irrelevant. And finally, the Argo, 2.5 kilometers of dreadnought, the most powerful weapon humanity had ever built. Her crew of 4,000 pressing hands against bulkheads in engine rooms and mess halls and weapons bays. And the vibration they received was the largest and the warmest of all, because the entity had the most to say to the ship it was most curious about. Across 48 vessels, 12,000 crew members pressed their hands against metal and let themselves be read. The vibration deepened beyond sound, beyond sensation, into something Kale could only describe as presence, the experience of being known without summary, understood without judgment, held without confinement. Torres wept silently at his station, tears tracking down his face, his hands still flat, his eyes open and focused on something no instrument could display. A Marine in the port hangar bay laughed once, a single sharp bark of sound, and could not explain afterward what had been funny, only that something inside him had recognized something inside the vibration, and the recognition had come out as laughter. In the Argo's engine room, a chief engineer with 31 years of service sat down on the deck plating, pressed both palms flat, and later described the experience as being held by something the size of the ocean. The white light brightened, not painfully but with a quality that made the clearing feel like a room with the curtains thrown open after a long night. Inside the transparent section, the beings moved deeper into the object's interior, and as they moved, the geometry behind them shifted, corridors branching, chambers expanding, rooms sealed for 230 million years filling with light for the first time since the builders had closed them and turned their attention to the void and the long, patient, faithful wait. Making room. Kale stood on the Meridian's bridge and watched an intelligence older than the fossil record welcome 12,000 strangers into a home it had built before anything in the galaxy had a name. Not with weapons or conditions or demands. With light and with the vast, aching relief of something that had been alone in the dark longer than anything else alive, and was now no longer alone. He thought about the Junko, sitting in the Meridian's hangar 3 decks below. His ship, his rebuilt, patched, stubborn 60-meter ship with its delayed starboard thruster and its velcroed wrench and its perfect coffee maker. The signal that had found him not a fleet, not an admiral, not a scientist or a diplomat. A salvage operator, a man who fixed broken things for a living because he believed broken things deserved to be fixed. The beings had waited because they believed, not in a government or a fleet or a technology, in a person, curious, flawed, persistent, afraid, and moving forward anyway. That was what they had trusted the universe to produce across geological time. What they had built the object for, seeded the signal for, waited for through ice ages and extinctions, and the rise and fall of species that never looked up at the right part of the sky at the right moment. and the universe had sent a salvage operator with grease under his fingernails, and a ship held together by second-hand parts and 14 years of refusing to quit. He could still hear the signal, not through the speakers, through the deck under his feet, through the railing under his hand, through the warmth in his chest that had been there since the amber light. The three-part harmonic, the invitation that had broadcast for eons, now carrying 12,000 new voices woven into its structure. No longer a question sent into the dark, a conversation, the first one. The first of many. Admiral Chen's voice carried across the bridge, clear and steady, and made of the same iron that held her ship together. Log it, Terran Sovereignty, first contact confirmed. Entity designation pending, species unknown. Origin predates all galactic records by 230 million years minimum. Intent assessed as non-hostile. Assessment basis, direct communication via unknown medium confirmed by 12,000 crew across 48 vessels. They are not hostile, they are not afraid. She paused. When she spoke again, something had changed, something 30 years of discipline could not fully contain. Not weakness. Not doubt, something warmer. They have been expecting company. The vibration hummed through every hull in the formation, warm and deep and patient, and the ancient harmonic that had broadcast into the emptiness of the Kessler Shoals, since before anything in the galaxy had ears to hear it, was, for the first time in 230 million years, no longer a question. It was an answer.